1976, there's been more than 1,200 executions. Recall that 1976 is when Gregg v. Georgia is decided and executions resume in the United States. Today, our protocols require methods that inflict as little pain as possible. And when those methods of execution are challenged, which generally is lethal injection, states begin adopting other methods as a backup in case lethal injection is deemed unacceptable. And what we consider acceptable as a method of execution has changed over time. So early on, it was meant to be a very terrifying experience. The idea here being that we have these dual goals of deterrence and retribution. But the most common methods in recent history and that are still potentially in use are the following 5: hanging, electrocution, gas chamber, firing squad, and lethal injection. So hanging first becomes popular in colonial America, and it's the main method until the 1890s. It is convenient, simple, and low cost, and does minimal damage to the body. Ideally, if done properly, it should be painless. It should result in an instant severing of the spinal cord after dropped from the rope. But few hangings went as planned. Between a painless execution and a painful execution. And it depends on things like how high of a drop the executionee is experiencing, how elastic the rope is, where the knot is positioned, the weather, the tension in the individual's neck, and the skills of the hangman. So they begin experimenting with the design of the gallows, and the gallows is the actual, device and platform. And this is designed to create more force to break the condemned man's necks than could be exerted in the traditional drop. And this is achieved by using a system and secure a rope with sandbags on the opposite side. And the sandbags are supposed to exceed the inmate's weight, with the idea being that this would sever the ropes and pulleys were not always properly set, and this could result in a long period of suffering. And the lack of the experience of the executioner is a key factor. There's no real training, they're relatively rare events, and gallows are constructed on short notice. They tried adjusting the length of the ropes. They thought that by expanding the length, the body would drop further and faster, and it did, but it also resulted in decapitation because of the high velocity and force of the body weight. They tried using water for weighting and experimented with different types of trapdoors. And some prisons allowed inmates to construct their own method of hanging. So in Delaware, they're seeking to execute convicted murderer Billy Bailey by hanging, which was his choice, in 1996. And there hadn't been a hanging in Delaware for more than 50 years, so now they have to learn how to actually do that. So they look to the Washington State Department of Corrections for help because they had executed Wesley Allen Dodd by hanging 3 years before. And they also looked at a U.S. Army hanging manual from 1969. This specified the length and diameter of the rope, that you should boil the rope to prevent coiling, that you should lubricate it so that it has a smooth sliding action. And Bailey was the last inmate that was hung in the United States. So hanging has largely been discontinued because we can't really ensure efficiency or protect the condemned from suffering, but it is still an authorized method in Delaware, New Hampshire, and Washington. So people start looking for a new method and they turn to science. The offender to a chair, and so we get the term electric chair. Now the idea for the electric chair is first discussed, or the use of electricity, is first discussed in an editorial for Scientific American. They suggested that offenders be placed in a chair with a bulb fixed to their head that would be attached to a live electrical wire connected to a streetlight. The chair would be fitted with a clock-like apparatus allowing executioners to set a time for death, which would relieve the executioner of the burden directly associated with causing death, and that this should provide a quick and painless death. When Dr. Alfred Southwick, a New York dentist, witnesses an accidental electrocution, he begins experimenting with electrocuting dogs. He then contacts his friend, a New York senator, who in turn convinced the New York State Legislature to appoint a committee to search for a new execution method. And in 1886, we have the New York Death Penalty Committee, and their goal is to find a less barbaric method for executing offenders and to find the most humane method. And they considered 34 various methods, but focused primarily on electrocution. The New York legislature decided on electrocution then as its sole method, and other states quickly followed suit. So the offender would be placed in a wooden chair secured by straps on their arms, waist, and legs, and this would ensure that their body stayed in place and they could not escape. Otherwise, when electrocuted, the body could be launched across the execution room. So the first person electrocuted is William Kemmler, and he's electrocuted in Auburn State Prison in 1890. They settled at that point on a 10-second time period. They thought 15 seconds was too long. But at the end of the 10 seconds, he was still breathing and had a heartbeat. So they electrocuted him again for 8 minutes. And despite this horrible failure, electrocution became the next big thing. Scientists teamed up with politicians to improve the method, despite mounting evidence of botched executions. In 1946, Willie Francis survives his initial execution and is returned to his cell. Supreme Court then rules that the malfunction was an unforeseeable accident and that the executioners were acting with care. Therefore, a second attempt at executing him would not force him to, quote, suffer unnecessary pain. And these botched executions continue well into the 1990s. Jesse Tefero in 1990 required 3 jolts of electricity to die. They used a synthetic sponge instead of a natural sponge, which led to 6-inch flames on his head. And in 1999, when Alan Lee Davis was executed, blood came pouring out of his mouth. There are 8 states that still authorize this method: Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. And so in 2014, Tennessee passed this as their backup method. They're the first state to do so without giving offenders the option to choose other methods. So we start thinking about more humane methods. At some point, and Nevada reintroduces the gas chamber. So here's a picture of the gas chamber. So this is introduced in the late 19th century, so remember that's the 1800s. The Medical Society of Allegheny County said this was more humane than the electric chair. And the original concept was that you would be humanely executed while you slept soundly in your cell. You wouldn't know your exact date of execution, so any anxiety associated with it would be avoided. And the use of the gas chamber did not require much convincing because people had already been using this, to get rid of unwanted pets. So in 1921, the Humane Death Bill is passed. This is an effort to ensure executions are humane. They did not specify how to carry them out. They wanted the prisoner sleeping in the cell with only a small number of witnesses. And in 1924, G. John is going to be executed this way, and they discover it's not really practical to execute him in his cell because the cells are not airtight. So instead, we need to construct a special chamber that has a chair and a window for viewing purposes for the witnesses. The officials had to drive to California to purchase the hydrocyanic acid because the manufacturer would not ship it due to safety concerns. This essentially suffocates you by preventing your cells from receiving oxygen. And they had tested it successfully on bed bugs and kittens. And it took 6 minutes to execute John. Now, a lethal gas execution takes about 15 minutes. They mix cyanide poison with sulfuric acid and water. To ensure that the person is dead, they're left in the chamber for an extra half hour after the physician has confirmed their death. But this method is very costly. It needs to be built indoors. It's stationary. It needs to be airtight. You need an executioner with expertise, and it does pose a potential risk to witnesses. So usually there's just one chamber at a centralized location in a state prison. This is very popular for a short period of time. Most states had never implemented the practice. Nevada used it for about a decade, and 10 other states eventually followed, most of which were in the South and West, who had not yet adopted the electric chair. Some felt because it separated the offender from everyone and left him to die alone, that it was barbaric and eerie. No other method left the offender entirely alone to die. But because of World War I and World War II, Arizona's first gas chamber left the offender gasping for air, making obscene gestures, and twitching for more than 10 minutes. One of the last gas executions was Jimmy Gray in 1983, and he continued gasping for air for 8 minutes. They eventually led the witnesses out of the room because it was so appalling. He died banging his head against a steel pole while reporters counted his moans. Arizona, California, Missouri, and Wyoming still allow for the gas chamber, and the last person executed this way was Walter LeGrand in 1999. Firing squad. Only 2 states use a firing squad, Utah and Nevada. Nevada abolished it in 1921 when they adopted the gas chamber, and this method is rarely used. And since 1976, only 3 have been executed this way, all of which occurred in Utah, the last being in 2010, who is Ronnie Lee Gardner. So currently it's only an option in Utah and Oklahoma, and it's used as a backup method. Anybody sentenced before 2004 in Utah can actually choose this method. And the firing squad is adopted by the Mormons for what's called blood atonement. This is the requirement that an offender who commits murder sacrifice his or her own life in a manner that sheds blood, so the offender can partially atone for the sin committed. Utah also allowed for beheading in the past for similar reasons. An accurate shot should kill an offender quickly and painlessly. Lethal injection is obviously the method in use today. It's first enacted in 1977 in Oklahoma by politicians Bill Wiseman and Bill Dawson. Oklahoma's electric chair needed to be repaired, and the cost was going to be $62,000. Building a gas chamber would have cost them $300,000. So they asked the Oklahoma Medical Association to help them develop a drug cocktail, but the association refused to help. Instead, a medical examiner, Dr. J. Chapman, agreed to help. He did no research in developing the method that is still used today. Okay? He wanted at least 2 drugs in doses that would each kill the prisoner, and later he added a 3rd drug because, quote, why not? He did warn of the risk of improper administration, that if it was administered improperly, offenders could potentially experience extreme pain. So, there's a 3-drug cocktail and a 1-drug cocktail. The 3-drug cocktail allows you to be properly anesthetized prior to the 2nd and 3rd drug. This should spare you the excruciating pain, including asphyxiation, severe burning, massive muscle cramping, and cardiac arrest. So the first drug is a barbiturate, which suppresses the central nervous system, sedates you, and should induce unconsciousness. The second drug is a paralytic, which paralyzes your lung and diaphragm and stops you from breathing. And the 3rd drug causes cardiac arrest. Now, if you're properly anesthetized, if you're improperly administered, you may appear unconscious but actually be conscious. You would feel all those painful effects. So it's very difficult with lethal injection to know if the execution has gone awry. So because this has been very haphazardly put together, it's led to a lot of complications. Most states don't individualize drug dosage based on offender size and weight. Generally, when we use barbiturates in surgery, sophisticated technology monitors the patient to ensure they're properly anesthetized. So if you're someone who has a substance abuse disorder or suffers from anxiety, you might require higher doses in order to be unconscious. Post-mortem levels of the sodium thiopental are not always sufficient for adequate sedation. 88% of cases, it was lower than what would even be required for surgery. And 43% had levels indicating some type of awareness. So many botched executions have been documented by the media. Angel Diaz in Florida took nearly 34 minutes to die. He was moving around and trying to mouth words. The needle had been pushed through his vein, releasing the chemical into a soft tissue. So he suffered extreme pain, and his skin showed signs of severe chemical burns. In Oklahoma, Clayton Lockett was deemed unconscious from the first drug, but then began breathing heavily, writhing on the gurney, clenching his teeth, and straining to lift his head off the pillow. They halted the execution, evacuated the witnesses. They then decided they were going to stay his execution for 2 weeks, but then he did die in the execution room. So, one thing to think about is if the barbiturate can be administered, that first drug, in a lethal dose, why use any additional drugs that can cause extreme pain? And so Ohio is the first state to adopt a 1-drug method, which is just a continual flow of barbiturate until the offender is pronounced dead. So one big issue today is drug availability. So sodium thiopental is no longer available. and the manufacturer stopped making it in 2009 because of difficulty obtaining a key ingredient. The Italian government would not let them make it in Italy unless they promised it would not be sold for this in the U.S., and the following year the British forbid selling it to the U.S. as well. So we switched to pentobarbital, which is not commonly used on humans. It's usually used to anesthetize or euthanize animals. Most recently, Missouri tried to obtain propofol, which you may have heard of because this is the drug that was abused by Michael Jackson and led to his death. But most European manufacturers, again, will not sell it to corrections departments. So some states looked at compounding pharmacies, which is a pharmacy that actually makes the drugs as opposed to just distributing them. And the lack of regulation prevents the purchaser, though, from knowing exactly what the drug's ingredients are. In 2013, Georgia enacted the Lethal Injection Secrecy Act, which protects drug suppliers and calls that information a state secret. Most states do, in fact, protect the identities of their executioners, but this Georgia law also protects the identity of the drug that's being used. So most organizations that develop professional and ethical guidelines for medical professionals forbid them to assist in executions. Now, they may lose membership status, but there may not be any other consequences beyond that. However, specialty boards may issue severe sanctions. So the American Board of Anesthesiology will revoke your certification if you participate in an execution, which means you will not be able to practice medicine. So most states can't find doctors or RNs to assist in executions, so they often appoint teams with phlebotomists, medical assistants, EMTs, and military medics. So again, we don't have a physician who's able to monitor the offender's level of consciousness or advise what to do with, needled infiltration or to ensure adequate doses. So that means we're going to have botched executions. So last words and last meals. You've probably heard of this, and you can actually Google most offenders' last meals if you wanted to. These are rituals that restore a small measure of control over what remains of an offender's life. And that wraps up this chapter on methods of execution.